This video is an educational documentary based on publicly available records, court documents, and official reports. My name is Jake, and today I will talk about 8 well-known criminal cases involving women in the United States. Case 1. Nicole M. Abu Sharif. In March 2007, a legal case from Villa Park, Illinois, drew national attention due to its complex personal dynamics, financial questions, and the extensive investigation that followed. This video presents an educational overview of the case involving Nicole M. Abu Sharif, based on publicly available court records, trial testimony, and appellate decisions. The purpose of this content is informational and documentary in nature, focusing on how the justice system examined evidence, testimony, and motive over time. Nicole Abu Sharif and Rebecca Becky Klein had been in a long-term domestic partnership and shared a home together. To friends and family, the relationship appeared stable and committed. However, court proceedings later revealed that behind the scenes, the relationship had become strained by secrecy, conflicting expectations, and outside involvement. Investigators would ultimately argue that these internal pressures played a significant role in what later unfolded. On March 17, 2007, Rebecca Klein was reported missing after failing to appear for work. The report was filed by Abu Sharif, who told authorities she was unable to locate her partner. Law enforcement officers began a routine missing person inquiry, which soon escalated when Klein was located inside the trunk of a vehicle parked in the garage of the shared residence. This discovery shifted the case from a welfare check to a full criminal investigation. Authorities concluded that Klein had lost her life 2 days earlier, on March 15th. Investigators determined that she had been restrained and rendered unable to escape. While official documents describe the method in technical terms, prosecutors emphasized that the act involved deliberate steps rather than an accident. Because of this, the case proceeded under intentional wrongdoing statutes rather than negligence-based charges. As detectives reconstructed the timeline, attention quickly turned to Abu Sharif's activities on the night Klein disappeared. Evidence presented at trial showed that Abu Sharif spent that evening socializing with another woman, Rose Sodaro, whom she had met online. The two went out together and later returned to Abu Sharif's residence. Sodaro testified that she believed Klein was merely a roommate, not a long-term partner, and said she was unaware of the true nature of the household dynamics. Investigators also examined Abu Sharif's financial circumstances. Court records showed that she was the beneficiary of multiple insurance policies connected to Klein, with a combined potential payout of approximately $400,000. Prosecutors argued that this financial incentive, combined with the desire to pursue a different relationship, formed a possible motive. The defense countered that financial planning alone did not establish intent. Forensic analysis became one of the most critical components of the case. Specialists testified that Abu Sharif's fingerprints and palm prints were found on several items connected to the scene, and DNA evidence linked her directly to materials used during the incident. Prosecutors presented this scientific evidence as objective confirmation of involvement, while the defense argued that shared living space explained the presence of such traces. During the investigation, authorities also identified inconsistencies in Abu Sharif's statements. She admitted during testimony that she had provided false information to friends, family members, and investigators about her background and personal history. These fabrications included exaggerated professional claims and serious medical conditions that were later proven untrue. Prosecutors argued that this pattern of deception undermined her credibility. Another figure briefly examined during the investigation was Robert L. Edwards, a co-worker of Abu Sharif. Edwards was later convicted of providing false information to investigators, but was never charged in connection with Klein's death. His case highlighted how peripheral individuals can complicate investigations, even when they are not directly responsible for the core offense. Nicole Abu Sharif's trial began in April 2009 and lasted several weeks. Jurors heard testimony from law enforcement officers, forensic experts, family members, and acquaintances. Abu Sharif chose to testify in her own defense, acknowledging her dishonesty during the investigation, but denying responsibility for Klein's death. The defense strategy focused on questioning whether Abu Sharif was physically capable of acting alone. Defense attorneys argued that Abu Sharif suffered from physical limitations and weighed significantly less than Klein, suggesting that it would have been difficult for her to restrain and move another adult without assistance. While this argument introduced doubt about logistics, prosecutors responded that the absence of defensive injuries did not rule out controlled restraint. After more than 13 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict in May 2009. Abu Sharif was found guilty under Illinois law. However, jurors declined to classify the act as pre-planned to the highest degree, which affected sentencing options. This distinction removed the possibility of a life sentence without release consideration. In July 2009, Abu Sharif was sentenced to 50 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections. Under state law, she must serve the entirety of this term before becoming eligible for supervised release. Appeals were later filed, but the conviction and sentence were upheld by the Illinois Appellate Court in 2011. The case left lasting effects on both families involved. Rebecca Klein was remembered by loved ones as a compassionate individual devoted to helping people with disabilities. Her loss created a void that no legal outcome could fully address. For Abu Sharif's family, the verdict marked the beginning of a different kind of hardship, one defined by public scrutiny and personal grief. This case illustrates how personal relationships, financial considerations, and credibility can intersect within the legal system. It also demonstrates how courts rely on a combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and behavioral analysis to reach conclusions. While the legal process delivered a final judgment, questions surrounding human behavior and trust remain long after a sentence is imposed. Case 2. Brittany Marie Adams. Brittany Marie Adams was born in 1993 and was 19 years old at the time of the incident. She lived in Topeka, Kansas. Prior to this case, she was not widely known to the public. The individual who lost his life was Gary Bell Edens, a 51-year-old man living in Lawrence, Douglas County, Kansas. He was a father and grandfather, and according to statements later shared in court, his family described him as a devoted parent whose absence left a lasting impact. On July 17, 2013, Adams traveled from Topeka to Lawrence with a man named Jonathan Rush, who was 29 years old and from Wichita. According to statements given during the investigation, Adams believed her car had been taken by two acquaintances and claimed she was trying to locate them or recover information about the vehicle. Rush drove Adams to a residence on Michigan Street in Lawrence, where Gary Edens was staying at the time. When Adams and Rush arrived at the home, Gary Edens answered the door. Inside the residence was also his adult son, Jeremy Edens, as well as a younger child. What happened next unfolded quickly. A confrontation began shortly after the visitors approached the door. Testimony later described a physical struggle involving Gary Edens, his son Jeremy, and Jonathan Rush. During this chaotic moment, a firearm discharged. Gary Edens collapsed outside the home and did not recover from his injuries. Law enforcement was called to the scene around 6:20 p.m. Emergency responders attempted life-saving efforts, but Gary Edens was later pronounced deceased at a nearby hospital. The incident marked the first loss of life classified as a homicide in Lawrence since 2008, drawing significant attention from local authorities and the community. Adams and Rush left the scene in Rush's vehicle and drove back toward Topeka. According to later court documents and testimony, items connected to the incident were discarded along the route. Roughly 20 minutes after the confrontation, a Shawnee County Sheriff's lieutenant stopped the vehicle in Topeka. Both Adams and Rush were taken into custody that same evening. During subsequent interviews, investigators worked to piece together what had happened. Adams gave multiple statements over the following days. Rush also spoke with detectives. Their accounts differed in important ways, particularly regarding who was responsible for the firearm that discharged and under what circumstances. These inconsistencies became central to later legal proceedings. Initially, Adams was charged with second-degree murder under Kansas law. As the case progressed, prosecutors presented evidence during a preliminary hearing, including testimony from a former jail cellmate who claimed Adams made statements about the incident while in custody. Based on this testimony and other evidence, the prosecution requested that the charge be elevated to first-degree murder, arguing that the actions showed intent. A judge found probable cause to amend the charge, significantly increasing the potential penalties Adams faced. Jonathan Rush faced separate legal consequences. Because he had a prior felony conviction, federal authorities pursued charges related to unlawful firearm possession. The state-level charges against him in Douglas County were later dismissed in favor of federal prosecution. Rush eventually pleaded guilty to the federal charge and received a sentence of 40 months in prison. As Adams's case moved forward, negotiations took place between the defense and prosecution. In January 2014, Adams entered a guilty plea to intentional second-degree murder as part of a plea agreement. This agreement reduced the original first-degree charge, but required her to serve a lengthy prison sentence without seeking probation or reduced sentencing motions. She also entered pleas related to 2 additional felony counts involving threats made to a corrections officer while in custody. On February 27, 2014, Adams was sentenced in Douglas County District Court. The judge imposed a sentence of 155 months in prison, which is just under 13 years, for the second-degree murder charge. The sentences for the additional felony counts were ordered to run consecutively. Adams was also required to register as a violent offender for a decade following her release. During the sentencing hearing, Gary Edens' son Jeremy addressed the court. Speaking while incarcerated on an unrelated matter, he described the long-term impact of his father's death on their family. He spoke about his younger sibling and children who would grow up without a grandfather. His statement emphasized the lasting emotional cost of the events of July 17, 2013. Adams did not address the court before the sentence was handed down. From a legal perspective, this case highlights how rapidly situations can escalate when weapons are involved, and how actions taken in moments of conflict can lead to lifelong consequences. Prosecutors argued that Adams's choices before, during, and after the incident demonstrated intent and responsibility under the law. The defense, meanwhile, focused on the chaotic nature of the confrontation and Adams' age at the time. Ultimately, the court determined that a significant prison sentence was appropriate based on the evidence and plea agreement. Case 3. Erin Allegra. Erin Allegra was born in 1977 and was the mother of an 8-year-old boy named Tristan Michael Allegra. At the time of the incident, she was living in Port St. Lucie and experiencing significant personal difficulties. According to official records and investigative reports, her life had been marked by financial instability, job loss, and emotional distress in the months leading up to December 2008. These circumstances would later be referenced during interviews and court proceedings as part of the background context, though they did not excuse the actions that followed. On Christmas Eve of 2008, Allegra and her son checked into a room at a Holiday Inn in Port St. Lucie. Investigators later stated that the evening appeared calm on the surface. Allegra described watching movies and cartoons with her son, even recalling moments that suggested an attempt at normalcy. At one point, she reportedly asked him to turn off a cartoon she felt was not appropriate, a detail that investigators noted as part of her own description of the night. These details would later stand in stark contrast to what occurred in the early morning hours of Christmas Day. According to law enforcement affidavits, Allegra gave her son a quantity of over-the-counter medication intended to make him drowsy. Several hours later, during the early morning, authorities determined that the child stopped breathing after a pillow was pressed over his face. The investigation concluded that this action directly caused his death. The child was 8 years old and a third-grade student at Mariposa Elementary School, remembered by family members as talkative, gentle, and close to both parents. After realizing that her son was no longer alive, Allegra attempted to end her own life by injuring her wrists. This attempt was not successful. She later contacted emergency services, and responding personnel transported her to a medical facility for treatment of non-life-threatening injuries. Once released, she was interviewed by police. During questioning, Allegra did not deny her involvement. Investigators reported that she was aware of her actions and understood that they were wrong. In written materials recovered from the hotel room, including a letter addressed to her son and entries from a personal journal, Allegra expressed feelings of isolation and despair. One note described her sense of having nowhere else to go and an inability to move forward as others did. She told investigators that she believed she could not leave her child with his father, Michael Allegra, though court records show the couple had been separated rather than legally divorced. Michael Allegra, Tristan's father, later spoke publicly about his relationship with his son. At the time of the incident, he was incarcerated on a probation-related matter, but had maintained contact through letters and drawings. He described his son as his best friend and said he had no concerns about Tristan's safety while in his mother's care. Family members on both sides expressed shock, stating that Allegra had been seen as protective and attentive toward her child. Following the investigation, prosecutors initially filed a second-degree charge, which was later elevated after a grand jury indictment. The case moved through the legal system during 2009, with extensive consideration given to evidence, statements, and procedural factors. In early 2010, Allegra agreed to a plea arrangement in which she admitted guilt to premeditated first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse. By entering this plea, she avoided the possibility of a capital sentence. During the sentencing hearing in February 2010, Allegra appeared before a circuit judge wearing prison attire and restraints. She spoke briefly, responding only when addressed by the court. The judge accepted the plea agreement and imposed a sentence of life imprisonment for the primary charge, followed by an additional 30 years for the secondary charge, to be served consecutively. Prosecutors stated that while they believed a harsher penalty could have been pursued, the plea ensured certainty and finality within the legal process. Family members were given the opportunity to address the court. Tristan's paternal grandmother spoke about the depth of her loss, emphasizing that while the family could have mourned Allegra had she succeeded in harming herself, the loss of the child was irreversible. Her words highlighted the lasting impact such actions have on extended families and communities. Allegra's own grandmother also spoke afterward, acknowledging that any hope of a future reunion was no longer realistic. This case remains significant not because of graphic details, but because it illustrates how the justice system evaluates intent, responsibility, and consequence. It also demonstrates how personal hardship, while relevant for context, does not remove accountability under the law. The records show that Allegra was found competent, aware, and responsible for her actions, a factor that played a central role in the outcome. Case 4. Margaret Ann Allen. Margaret Ann Allen was born on January 23, 1966, and spent most of her life in Titusville, Florida. To many who knew her earlier in life, she appeared to be a devoted mother, trying to navigate difficult personal circumstances. Old newspaper photographs once showed her proudly holding her newborn daughter, symbolizing hope and stability. However, behind those images was a life marked by repeated exposure to violence, unstable relationships, and frequent contact with law enforcement. According to relatives and public records, Allen grew up in a neighborhood with persistent crime and limited social support. Family members later described a childhood shaped by an absent father and frequent instability. As she reached adulthood, Allen became involved in multiple relationships that reportedly included physical harm and emotional trauma. Over the years, she accumulated a criminal record involving assaults, drug-related offenses, and weapons violations, though many charges did not result in long-term imprisonment. By the early 2000s, Allen was living with a roommate and employed Wenda Wright, a 39-year-old woman who assisted her with household duties. Wright was not only a housekeeper, but also considered a friend. Their relationship, however, became strained after Allen believed that a purse containing approximately $2,000 had gone missing. Court testimony later revealed that Allen became convinced Wright was responsible, despite Wright repeatedly denying the accusation. On February 8, 2005, Wright was reported missing. Within days, investigators received information suggesting that she had not simply disappeared, but had been harmed. What followed was a complex investigation involving multiple witnesses and conflicting accounts. Allen's nephew, Quentin Allen, eventually came forward and provided statements to authorities describing events that allegedly occurred inside Allen's residence. His cooperation would later play a critical role in the case. According to prosecutors, the confrontation between Allen and Wright escalated into a prolonged and violent episode. Testimony stated that Wright was restrained and subjected to repeated physical force while Allen attempted to extract a confession regarding the missing money. Investigators reported that household substances were used in a manner intended to intimidate and cause extreme distress. Medical experts later testified that the incident lasted several hours and resulted in fatal injuries. After Wright became unresponsive, prosecutors alleged that Allen enlisted the help of her nephew and a roommate, James Martin, to remove and conceal the body. The group transported Wright to a remote area in northern Brevard County, where she was placed in a shallow burial site. Days later, guided by witness information, law enforcement officers located the site and recovered the remains. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide, listing violent physical trauma as the primary cause, with substance intoxication noted as a contributing factor. Allen was arrested along with Quentin Allen and James Martin. Both men eventually accepted plea agreements in exchange for their testimony. Quentin Allen pleaded to a lesser charge and received a reduced sentence, while Martin was convicted as an accessory and served several years in prison. Prosecutors described Margaret Allen as the central figure who directed the actions of others during and after the incident. The trial of Margaret Allen began years later and included extensive testimony from medical experts, law enforcement officers, and family members. The prosecution emphasized the length and severity of the assault, arguing that it demonstrated extreme cruelty and intent. Jurors heard descriptions of multiple injuries and were told that Wright experienced intense fear and suffering during her final moments. The defense, however, presented a different narrative. Attorneys argued that Allen suffered from neurological damage caused by earlier assaults in her life, which they claimed impaired her ability to control impulses and emotions. A neurologist testified that Allen's brain injuries could have affected her judgment and behavior. The defense also pointed to inconsistencies in witness statements and noted the presence of drugs in Wright's system, suggesting this may have worsened the outcome. Despite these arguments, the jury found Allen guilty of first-degree felony homicide and kidnapping. In the penalty phase, all 12 jurors unanimously recommended the most severe sentence allowed under Florida law at the time. In May 2011, Circuit Judge George Maxwell formally sentenced Margaret Allen to death, making her one of only a few women on Florida's death row. During sentencing hearings, emotions ran high. Allen addressed the court, maintaining her innocence and pleading for a life sentence. Members of her family wept openly, describing her difficult upbringing and moments of kindness they believed defined her character. At the same time, Wenda Wright's family spoke about their loss and the lasting impact on her children. Wright's partner expressed anger but also stated that forgiveness was part of his healing process. The case sparked broader discussion about violent crime, family cycles of instability, and the rarity of women receiving capital punishment. Legal experts noted that while women commit a smaller percentage of serious violent offenses, cases involving prolonged abuse and extreme circumstances often lead to harsher sentences. In Florida, only a small number of women have ever been executed, and even fewer have been sentenced to death in modern times. Law enforcement officials familiar with Allen's neighborhood later commented that while crime was prevalent in the area, many residents still managed to raise families and avoid criminal paths. They described Allen's life as a series of poor choices influenced by environment, relationships, and unresolved trauma. Community leaders echoed this view, emphasizing that background factors can shape behavior but do not remove personal responsibility. Case 5. Wanda Jean Allen. Wanda Jean Allen was born on August 17, 1959 in Oklahoma. She was the second of 8 children in a household marked by instability and hardship. Her mother struggled with alcohol dependency, and her father left the family when the youngest child was born. The family relied on public assistance and lived in public housing, often facing daily uncertainty and stress. From an early age, Allen experienced significant physical trauma. At around 12 years old, she was struck by a truck and lost consciousness. A few years later, she suffered a stabbing injury to her head. Later evaluations suggested these incidents may have contributed to lasting neurological and cognitive challenges. Psychological assessments conducted during her youth indicated an IQ score of 69, placing her in a range described by experts as significantly limited intellectual functioning. Specialists also noted difficulties with comprehension, impulse control, and understanding cause and effect relationships. By her teenage years, Allen had left school and entered adulthood without stable support systems. These factors would later become central to discussions about her behavior and decision-making. However, the first major legal incident occurred in 1981. Allen was living with a woman named Deetra Pettis, whom she had known for years. On June 29th of that year, an argument escalated, and Pettis was fatally injured by a gunshot. Allen stated that the discharge occurred accidentally during a confrontation involving Pettis's boyfriend. Investigators questioned this account, citing physical evidence that suggested close-range involvement. Despite inconsistencies, prosecutors accepted a plea agreement. Allen was convicted of first-degree manslaughter and received a 4-year sentence, serving approximately 2 years before release. Years later, while incarcerated, Allen met Gloria Jean Leathers. After both women were released, they resumed contact and eventually lived together. Their relationship was described by multiple sources as volatile, involving frequent arguments and emotional strain. On December 1, 1988, tensions reached a breaking point. Earlier that day, Allen and Leathers had a dispute at a grocery store that required police intervention. An officer escorted them home while Leathers gathered her belongings, intending to leave the residence. Leathers and her mother then drove to the village police department in Oklahoma City to file a formal complaint. Allen followed them. As Leathers exited the vehicle near the police station, a single gunshot was fired, striking her in the abdomen. Leathers' mother witnessed the incident. Although officers nearby heard the sound, no officer directly observed the moment. A .38 caliber handgun believed to be involved was later recovered nearby. Leathers was transported for medical treatment, but passed away several days later due to complications from the injury. Allen was arrested shortly afterward and formally charged with first-degree murder. The trial that followed focused heavily on intent, prior history, and credibility. Prosecutors portrayed Allen as someone with a pattern of violent responses to personal conflict. They emphasized the earlier manslaughter conviction and argued that the shooting was deliberate. The defense countered that Allen acted out of fear, pointing to claims that Leathers had previously boasted about a past fatal incident of her own. The court, however, ruled that certain testimony supporting this claim was inadmissible due to evidentiary rules. The jury ultimately found Allen guilty of first-degree murder. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors argued that she posed a continuing threat and had a prior conviction involving violence. The defense presented mitigating factors, including her difficult upbringing, cognitive limitations, work history, and expressions of remorse. After deliberation, the jury recommended the death penalty. Following the conviction, Allen spent 12 years on death row. During this period, multiple appeals were filed, challenging the effectiveness of her legal representation and the handling of evidence related to her mental capacity. A later affidavit from her trial attorney acknowledged that he had not sought psychological evaluations or expert testimony, despite earlier indications of neurological impairment. Subsequent assessments conducted in the mid-1990s identified clear signs of brain dysfunction and sensory motor deficits, potentially linked to her childhood injuries. Public attention intensified as her execution date approached. Advocacy groups, religious leaders, and civil rights figures argued that executing someone with documented intellectual limitations raised serious ethical concerns. Clemency hearings were held, during which Allen asked for forgiveness from the victim's family and pleaded for her life. The parole board voted against recommending clemency, and the governor declined to issue a stay. Despite protests and legal efforts, Allen's final appeals were denied by both state and federal courts. Officials emphasized that the case had undergone extensive review over more than a decade and that the legal process had been followed. On January 11, 2001, Wanda Jean Allen was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. She was 41 years old. Witnesses included family members of both victims, media representatives, and spiritual advisors. Her final words reportedly expressed forgiveness. Her execution marked a historical moment, as she became the first woman executed by Oklahoma since statehood, and one of only a small number of women executed in the United States in the modern era. Today, the case of Wanda Jean Allen continues to be examined in discussions about capital punishment, mental capacity, legal representation, and the boundaries of justice. It remains a reminder of how personal history, systemic factors, and irreversible outcomes can intersect within the legal system. Case 6. Angelica Salazar Alvarez. Angelica Alvarez was born on September 19, 1979. By 2006, she was a mother of 4 children, ranging in age from 2 to 8 years old. Those children were Jennifer Lopez, age 8, Gonzalo Lopez, age 6, Daniel Valdez, age 4, and Jessica Valdez, age 2. The family lived in Elkhart, Indiana, and by most outward appearances, their life did not draw public attention before the tragedy unfolded. Behind closed doors, however, testimony later revealed that Alvarez was struggling with overwhelming personal stress. She had recently lost her job and was facing instability in her marriage. Court records indicate that her husband was in the process of leaving, and Alvarez reportedly believed she would not be able to care for the children on her own. Friends and family would later describe her as emotionally distressed in the weeks leading up to November 14, 2006. On the evening of that day, Alvarez brought her 4 children into the basement of their home. What happened next would only fully emerge later through court proceedings and her own statements. Investigators determined that all 4 children lost their lives due to asphyxiation. Authorities ruled the deaths intentional and classified the case as a multiple homicide involving immediate family members. After the incident, Alvarez attempted to end her own life. She was discovered unconscious next to the children and transported to Elkhart General Hospital in critical condition. Initially, first responders believed she had also passed away, but they later detected a faint pulse. Her survival would lead to a lengthy legal process rather than an immediate conclusion to the case. Law enforcement began a detailed investigation, reviewing medical findings, household records, and prior police visits. Autopsies confirmed that the children had not been sedated, contradicting early speculation. Prosecutors later emphasized that the lack of substances in toxicology reports supported the argument that Alvarez was aware of her actions at the time. Angelica Alvarez was formally charged with 4 counts of murder under Indiana law. The prosecutor described the event as an unspeakable tragedy and stated that the severity of the case placed it among those eligible for the harshest possible penalties. However, the legal process would be complicated by questions surrounding Alvarez's mental condition. During early hearings, conflicting medical evaluations led the court to temporarily declare Alvarez incompetent to stand trial. She was sent to a state mental health facility in Logansport for treatment and observation. After several months, doctors reported improvement in her condition, and she was eventually deemed competent to proceed in court. In September 2007, Alvarez chose to enter a guilty plea to all 4 charges. As part of the agreement, she accepted a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. In return, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty. The plea also meant that Alvarez waived the right to argue mental illness as a mitigating factor during sentencing. During the sentencing hearing, both the prosecution and defense addressed the court. Prosecutors argued that the actions were planned and deliberate, emphasizing personal responsibility despite documented mental health struggles. The defense, on the other hand, urged the court to recognize severe psychological distress and the need to view mental illness with the same seriousness as physical illness. Angelica Alvarez addressed the court through an interpreter, expressing remorse and accepting responsibility for what had occurred. Her attorney stated that she had written a note prior to the incident explaining her emotional state and her belief at the time that her children would be better off without her. These statements became central to public discussions about perception versus accountability. The children's fathers were also present during proceedings. Gonzalo Lopez, the father of the 2 older children, spoke openly about the pain caused by the loss, but stated that he held no hatred toward Alvarez. His words reflected forgiveness rather than anger, a moment that left a strong impression on those in the courtroom. Community reaction to the case was intense. Hundreds attended the children's funeral, leaving flowers, notes, and stuffed animals near the family home. Neighbors and classmates struggled to understand how such a tragedy could occur in what had seemed like a normal household. Media coverage sparked broader conversations about mental health resources, especially for parents under extreme stress. Ultimately, the court sentenced Angelica Alvarez to life imprisonment without parole. She was transferred to the Indiana Department of Corrections, where she will remain for the rest of her life. The judge stated that while mental health factors were acknowledged, the law required accountability for the intentional loss of life. This case remains one of the most devastating family-related crimes in Indiana's history. It illustrates how untreated mental health struggles, combined with personal crisis, can escalate into irreversible outcomes. It also highlights the legal system's challenge in balancing compassion with justice when children are involved. Case 7. Brenda Evers Andrew. Brenda Andrew was born on December 16, 1963, and grew up in a small Oklahoma town in a religious household. By all outward appearances, she followed a traditional and stable path. She married her high school sweetheart, Robert "Rob" Andrew, and together they built a family with 2 children. Brenda stayed home to raise the kids while Rob worked as a successful advertising executive. To neighbors and church members, the family appeared respectable and well-established. However, as the years went on, the relationship between Brenda and Rob began to deteriorate. Testimony later revealed frequent marital tension, counseling sessions, and growing emotional distance. By 2001, Brenda and Rob were separated, and divorce papers had already been filed. At the same time, Brenda had begun a secret relationship with James Pavat, a fellow church member and insurance agent who had become closely involved with the family. One detail that would later become central to the investigation was a large life insurance policy. James Pavat had recently sold Rob Andrew a policy worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, with Brenda listed as the primary beneficiary. According to trial records, Rob had begun expressing fear for his safety, telling friends that something felt wrong. He even explored the possibility of changing the policy beneficiary, but was allegedly told that he could not do so. On the evening of November 20th, 2001, Rob Andrew went to Brenda's home to pick up their children for the holiday. Brenda told him there was a problem with the furnace and asked him to help in the garage. What happened next would become the core of one of Oklahoma's most closely watched criminal trials. Moments after entering the garage, Rob was seriously injured during an armed encounter. Brenda called emergency services, stating that 2 masked intruders had attacked them. She reported that her husband did not survive and that she herself had been wounded during the incident. At first glance, it appeared to be a tragic home invasion. However, investigators quickly noticed inconsistencies. There were no signs of forced entry, and the scene did not fully match Brenda's description. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered Brenda's relationship with James Pavat, the insurance policy, and a series of suspicious events leading up to the incident, including damage to Rob's vehicle weeks earlier that could have caused a serious accident. Witnesses testified that Rob had grown increasingly fearful in the weeks before his death. Several friends stated that he believed his wife and her companion were planning something harmful. These statements, combined with physical evidence and phone records, shifted the focus of the investigation away from unknown intruders and toward a planned act involving people Rob trusted. When authorities moved to arrest Brenda Andrew, they discovered that she had disappeared. James Pavat was also missing. The pair fled the country together with Brenda's children and remained on the run for several months. In February 2002, they were located and taken into custody near the U.S.-Mexico border, bringing an end to a multi-state manhunt. James Pavat was tried first. Prosecutors argued that he acted not only out of financial motivation, but also emotional attachment. Former colleagues described him as manipulative and emotionally detached, while his ex-wife testified that his personality had changed dramatically before the crime. The jury found Pavat guilty, and he received the most severe sentence allowed under Oklahoma law. Brenda Andrews' trial followed in 2004 and lasted several weeks. Prosecutors presented a detailed timeline, arguing that Brenda played an active role in planning the event, including staging the scene to mislead investigators. The defense maintained that James Pavat acted alone and that Brenda was a victim of circumstances. Despite these arguments, the jury concluded that the evidence showed coordinated intent and participation. In September 2004, Brenda Andrew was found guilty on all major counts. She was formally sentenced later that month, becoming the only woman on Oklahoma's death row at the time. During sentencing, Brenda maintained her innocence, calling the verdict a miscarriage of justice and stating that she would continue to fight the conviction through appeals. The case sparked widespread debate, not only because of its outcome, but because it challenged stereotypes. Brenda Andrew did not fit the public image many associate with serious crime. She was educated, active in her church, and known as a caregiver. Prosecutors argued that this image helped her avoid suspicion early on, while critics questioned whether emotional bias influenced public reaction. Today, the case of Brenda Andrew remains a subject of discussion in true crime communities, legal studies, and psychology courses. It raises difficult questions about trust, financial motivation, manipulation, and how personal relationships can intersect with criminal behavior. More importantly, it highlights how investigators piece together facts, verify narratives, and follow evidence even when the truth contradicts initial appearances. Case 8. Wendy Elizabeth Andriano. On August 6, 1970, Wendy Elizabeth Ochoa was born in the United States. In January of 1994, she married Joseph Andriano, a man described by friends as hardworking and devoted to his family. For several years, the marriage appeared stable, and the couple went on to have 2 children together. However, their lives changed dramatically when Joseph began experiencing serious health issues. After multiple incorrect diagnoses, Joseph was eventually diagnosed in 1998 with adenoid cystic carcinoma, a rare and aggressive form of cancer. Over time, his condition worsened, and doctors informed the family that the illness was terminal. Joseph initially explored alternative treatments, hoping to slow the progression of the disease, but by 2000 he had begun chemotherapy, which left him physically weak and dependent on care. During this period, Wendy worked as an apartment manager while also caring for their children and her ill husband. Prosecutors later argued that she grew resentful of the responsibilities placed on her. According to testimony, she began spending more time at bars and became involved in extramarital relationships. Witnesses stated that her lifestyle increasingly conflicted with the demands of caring for a terminally ill spouse. In the months leading up to October 2000, Wendy made several attempts to obtain life insurance policies on Joseph. She even asked acquaintances if they would pretend to be her husband during preliminary phone screenings. No policy was ultimately finalized, but these actions later became a central part of the prosecution's argument regarding motive. Investigators also discovered that Wendy had researched poisons and ordered sodium azide, a toxic chemical, using indirect methods to avoid attention. On the early morning of October 8, 2000, emergency services received a call from Wendy reporting that her husband was experiencing a medical emergency. Paramedics were dispatched to the couple's apartment in Waukee, Arizona. When they arrived, however, Wendy refused them entry, stating that Joseph had a do not resuscitate order and wished to pass away at home. With no visible signs of forced entry or disturbance, the paramedics left the scene. About an hour later, Wendy placed a second call to emergency services. This time, she reported that she had physically confronted her husband during a struggle and that he was unresponsive. When responders entered the apartment, they found Joseph Andriano deceased. The scene immediately raised concerns due to the extent of visible injuries. An autopsy later revealed that Joseph had suffered more than 20 impacts to the head and a deep wound to the neck. Toxicology reports also detected sodium azide in his system. Medical experts testified that the combination of chemotherapy and poisoning would have left Joseph extremely weak, making it unlikely that he could have defended himself effectively. In interviews with investigators, Wendy claimed that her actions were the result of self-defense. She alleged that Joseph had been physically and emotionally abusive throughout their marriage, and that he became enraged after learning about her affair. However, multiple friends and acquaintances testified that they had never observed signs of ongoing abuse. Prosecutors argued that her account was inconsistent with the physical evidence. The case went to trial in August 2004, nearly 4 years after Joseph's death. Despite having no prior criminal history, Wendy faced the most severe possible penalty under Arizona law. The prosecution presented evidence of her internet searches, attempts to secure financial benefits, and the procurement of toxic substances. They argued that the act was carefully planned and financially motivated. During the trial, Wendy took the stand in her own defense and testified for 9 days. She described herself as a victim of domestic violence and emotional control, stating that fear drove her actions. The defense argued that stress, religious devotion, and her role as a mother should be considered as mitigating factors. Despite this testimony, the jury found her guilty of first-degree murder on November 18, 2004. At the sentencing phase, jurors were asked to weigh aggravating and mitigating circumstances. The court determined that the act was especially cruel, citing both physical suffering and mental anguish endured by the victim. The financial motive further strengthened the aggravating factors. On December 22, 2004, Wendy Andriano was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Wendy filed multiple appeals, arguing that the jury was unfairly influenced by evidence related to her personal relationships and insurance inquiries. She also claimed that jurors should have been allowed to consider lesser charges. In July 2007, the Arizona Supreme Court reviewed the case and upheld both the conviction and the sentence. concluding that the trial had been conducted fairly. As of the early 2000s, Wendy Andriano remained incarcerated at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Perryville. Her case has been featured in several documentary-style television programs focused on criminal behavior, often cited as an example of how financial pressure and personal choices can intersect with tragic consequences. This case serves as a reminder that courtroom decisions are built not on emotion alone, but on evidence, timelines, and credibility. While public opinion may vary, the legal system ultimately relied on documented actions, expert testimony, and jury deliberation to reach its verdict. The story of Wendy Elizabeth Andriano continues to be studied in discussions about motive, justice, and accountability within the criminal justice system.